Okay, I think we'll go ahead and get started. So for those of you who are just joining us, my name is Casey Coman, and I am the president of the Social Work Students Association here at OU-Tulsa, and I'm so glad that you're all here. So I think the first thing that we're going to talk about real quick is the CEUs. So if you haven't been here already, the two things that you need to do in order to get your CEUs are make sure that your full name is in your Zoom profile. So if you're unsure of how to do that, please let me know. But your full name needs to be on there so that we have you recorded. And then we also need you to fill out the post-event survey, which I'll send out. I'll post the link in the chat here in just a second. We are going to record this session, and so and I'll post the link to our YouTube page where all of those will be posted. Also, if you would like to watch some of the ones that you missed, those will be there as well. We have closed captioning enabled, so please use that if you would like to. Okay, so I think that we are going to go ahead and get started with Molly Bryant, who is and actually an OU grad. She graduated in 2018 from the social work program, and she is a current community faculty member at OU. She's also the Senior Director of Immigrant and Refugee Services at the YWCA of Tulsa. We're so pleased to have her here today, and thank you so much, Molly. Take it away.
Thank you. I'm excited to be here. So yeah, I'm Molly Bryant. I'm our Senior Director of Immigrant and Refugee Services at YWCA Tulsa. And I have been our Director of Case Management for the past 2 years, as we've seen an incredibly exponential increase in refugees arriving in Tulsa. So I just want to spend a little bit of time today talking about refugee services in Tulsa and what they look like and why we do what we do. So just want to do a little introduction of myself as a social worker, briefly a little bit about our YWCA mission and our services, some relevant terminology about immigrants and refugees, the context in which we're working right now with refugees in Tulsa, and then what community building looks like, which is the ultimate goal of refugee resettlement. This is a quick presentation, so I just want to warn you that you will not get all questions answered or all information around refugees. So this is basically a quick, brief overview of several different topics. So just know that. Starting out, this is me personally. So this is my baby Zephyr and my baby dog Arlo. So I am a very proud recent mother and figuring out how to be a social worker and a mom. So this is what I spend all my time outside of work doing, just playing with my babes. My professional background took me all over the world. So I was born and raised in Creek County. I'm a Creek County girl. I'm a proud Cherokee citizen, lifetime Okie. Whenever I graduated from high school, I actually moved to Ghana, West Africa, and taught at a preschool and ran a guest house. I was 19. It just totally rocked my world, changed my whole worldview. Then I went to Kansas City, where I got my undergraduate degree in history from William Jewell College. If anyone's ever heard of it, congratulations, because most people have never heard of William Jewell. During college, I spent 5 months in Central America. And that's really where my interest in working, particularly with immigrants, started. So I studied with a social justice program in Guatemala, El Salvador, and Nicaragua. Lived with guerrilla fighters from multiple civil wars. Was just really like smacked in the face by what U.S. intervention looks like across the world. I like lived with activists who were social justice and political leaders in these countries. They had been detained. One is currently detained by a government. Just really got like a pretty incredible experience learning what, like our US government looks like and behaves in other countries. Right after that, I went to Amsterdam and spent a few months in Amsterdam researching human trafficking. That was my interest, continues to be, but an interest of mine. Work specifically researching PTSD with survivors of human trafficking who are mostly immigrants from the Caribbean. After that, I was like, I got to learn a language because I can't do this kind of work without really being able to communicate. So I moved to Ecuador, where I taught English and learned Spanish. And then after that, moved to Mexico to work for the same social justice program that I had been at in Central America, and focused on human rights and immigration and migration to and from the United States from folks in Central America and Mexico. I came back to Tulsa and did not expect to stay, but I became a caseworker for immigrant youth and their families in East Tulsa and then also the Kendall Whittier area. I very reluctantly went back and got my social work degree. Really fought it for several years. I didn't understand what social work was or what you could do with it. But I went back, I fell in love with social work, understood a whole lot more about the community practice side of social work, around activism and advocacy and policy. And I worked for Karen Gray. If anyone here knows, Karen has since retired, but I worked with her as her GA and was, oh, and Becky too. I did a practicum with Becky, who just commented in the chat. But I worked for Karen Gray, focusing on community organizing with immigrant communities. Did my practicum at Divis, ended up getting hired at Divis, worked in the jail with particularly women who are on immigration holds. And then I eventually moved to YWCA, where I had intended to get away from crisis for a while and focus on program building. And about 4 months into my job at YWCA, the Taliban took over Afghanistan and crisis followed. So I have spent the last year and a half working really on the Afghan crisis, building capacity within our team at the YWCA, and then working to build community with newly arrived folks. Feel free, like Casey mentioned, to add any comments or questions. It's only a few of your cameras on, so it's hard for me to tell like if you all are, how you all feel, or if you have any questions, so just drop them there. Check. Thank you. So our mission at YWCA is a really heavy mission. We are dedicated to eliminating racism, empowering women, and promoting peace, justice, freedom, and dignity for all. Super heavy mission, but it is one that is really, truly our guide in everything we do as the agency. So our immigrant and refugee services are our case management department, which provides mostly assistance in getting folks employed in non-exploitative positions where they will be able to grow and thrive in Tulsa. We also provide legal services. So these are for refugees and immigrants. We do a lot of family reunification cases. We assist in getting refugees through the entire immigration process up to their green card, and help people file for DACA, all kinds of things. We do youth education. So this looks like tutoring in a lot of our public schools, Also, we have an Afghan youth mentoring program where we partner an Afghan youth, 18 to 24, with hopefully, but not always, an Afghan young adult, and make sure that they're assisting, like when you move to the US and you don't have anyone who understands the system from your culture, it's really, really important to be able to develop that and build those relationships so that people know how to function in the US through tons of trauma and transition. We also have adult education. Those are our English and citizenship classes. We also have digital skills classes. And we currently have a class for folks who are going through our driver's education program to make sure that they understand how to pass their test and also how to read. And then we have interpretation and translation. And this is, we have about 15 different languages that we have on staff through all of our programs, but our interpretation and translation in particular. And we partner, if any of your organizations are needing assistance in interpretation and translation, please reach out to me. We will connect you and get you set up. Super, super important for people to have language access so that they can fully receive the services that they need. I'm just really proud of our staff. So in that Immigrant and Refugee Services Department, we have 76 staff, massive. We have 5 departments who serve over 1,200 clients. We've grown, again, like I mentioned, exponentially. Whenever I started in March of 2021, my team was a team of 4, and now we are a team of 21 or 22. So we've grown a lot, which comes with tons of growing pains. But in our department, just for those who are doing the work, not including the interpretation, we have native fluency in English, Spanish, Zoni, Burmese, Hmong, Dari, Pashto, Urdu, Hindi, Arabic, Ukrainian, and Russian. Also super proud of that. We hire from within the community and make sure that people are supported through that. So this is us celebrating the Persian New Year last week. We had incredible, that's another great thing about working here is we do a lot of potlucks. And so we have incredible. Okay, so just briefly, whenever I'm talking about our clients, I may say refugee, immigrant, asylee, and this is just a graphic that I've used to explain kind of what that means. So immigrant is really an umbrella term for all different kinds of folks. So you may have heard of undocumented individuals, parolees. Most people have not heard of parolees, but it's becoming more common. And that is not parolees from jail. It is humanitarian parolees who are similar to refugees. Asylees, refugees, citizens, and residents all fall under the umbrella of immigrants. So a refugee is a person who is designated. So the United Nations decides who is a refugee and who is not. So a refugee is a person who has fled their own country because they are at risk of serious human rights violations and persecution. And then they've been designated as that. An asylum seeker or an asylee is a person who has left their country and is seeking protection from persecution and serious human rights violations in another country, but who hasn't yet been legally recognized as a refugee. And they're typically waiting to receive a decision on their asylum claim. So when you hear stories of asylum seekers at the border, they often get, yes, I can define parolee. They often get less compassion and less, well, they have less rights, but they often get less compassion because it is assumed that people who are seeking asylum on the border, the US-Mexico border, are just trying to get into the country. They are trying to get into the country, but it's for mostly the exact same reasons that refugees are allowed into the country. So refugees are welcomed in the country. I'll explain kind of the process of that. But there is very little difference in the background and experience and environment which asylees leave from, and refugees. Parolees, so it gets, typically they're called humanitarian parolees. And those would be folks from Afghanistan. Most people from Afghanistan have been identified as humanitarian parolees. Also, Ukrainians right now are designated as humanitarian parolees. We often say refugee because it's much more understandable, but humanitarian parolees come into the US in very much the same process as refugees, but they have they do not have a pathway to a green card. So refugees have a very specific, you enter within 5 years, you can apply for your green card, and then you can become a US citizen. Obviously, there's tons of steps in between, but there's a process for it. For humanitarian parolees, you get paroled into the United States for a certain amount of time. And during that certain amount of time, you get your work visa, you can access benefits. But in the meantime, you have to apply for asylum or for some other kind of visa. So it's kind of a stopgap in between another process. So most people who enter, not everyone, but most people who enter as humanitarian parolees immediately start their asylum process and actually have to start it within a year so that they then, when their parole is up, they then have the ability to stay in the US legally. There's like tons of complications to that, but that's like the most succinct way, I guess I can describe it. I hope that makes sense. So in the chat, if you could, why do you think people become refugees? Any reason? There are 26 million refugees worldwide. Oppression, they're not safe in their own countries, safety, war, displacement. Yes, absolutely. So, yep, all of that. So war is typically the number one. It can be civil war, it can be multi-nation war, not civil war. Natural disasters are huge, yes. Violence, so that looks like someone mentioned oppression, it can be violence specifically targeting an ethnic or religious minority. So it's not just violence in the country, it's violence against a specific group of people who are protected. Religious persecution is part of that. So I often think of Burma, Myanmar, where a lot of our refugees are from. They are escaping religious persecution either from being in the Christian minority or the Rohingya Muslim minority. Both have been targeted for their religion. Political persecution, so people who speak out in places like Russia, people who speak out against the government are often seeking refuge in other countries in order to survive. And then racial or ethnic persecution. So the Rohingya Muslim population in Burma is doubly oppressed, probably triply, but doubly oppressed through their religion and their ethnicity as well. Refugees in Oklahoma. So prior to Afghan arrivals and Ukrainian arrivals, for you all who are doing the work, where have you seen refugees come from? Where do you think most refugees in Oklahoma come from? You can drop that in the chat. Syria, yep, Burma, Vietnam. Already named several. So number one, aside from Marshall Islands, very interesting, yes. South America. So some of these, yes, are designated refugees. Others fall under a different category. So most South American countries do not get refugee status. Venezuelans are allowed some humanitarian parole status. But in Oklahoma, Burma and Myanmar is the number one, aside from Afghan arrivals. Iraq, Eritrea, Syria, and Russia. So, well, see, but this is where everyone is coming from. And now we have now our number one population is Afghan. And then we're also starting to see a lot of Ukrainians. So people often think that refugees come to the US, they choose the US, and they, get to come and they're refugees, right? We take care of them. Fortunately, that is not the case. So this is the refugee resettlement process. It says for sub-Saharan Africa, it's very, very similar for a lot of other places. But I thought this was a good graphic to explain the entire process. We don't have time to go into the entire process, but basically you get identified, what we just mentioned, through war, political persecution, racial persecution, all these sort of things. You get identified by the UN. The UN identifies you, right? Then you get typically, you either left or you are leaving, and you typically get placed in a refugee camp. Some folks are there for 10 months, 11 months. Others are there for 20 years, 30 years. So there's a large portion of folks who are born in refugee camps and who grew up in refugee camps. The process is incredibly long and taxing for a lot of people, especially sub-Saharan Africa. So you go to a refugee camp, you have no idea how long you'll be there. You eventually go through interview processes. So if you get selected to come to the US, so you don't get a choice. If you have family members in the US, they call it a US tie, and you may get chosen to go to the US because it's easier to resettle folks who have a community. So you'll go through an interview process that is intense. So one of our coworkers is from Iraq, and her interview process was 3 interviews that were 8 hours long. And they combed through everything she said, and everything she'd ever done in her life. You then go through vetting and screening, lots and lots of vetting and screening. If you have anything like flagged in your background that is potentially dangerous or that may be assumed dangerous, you will be kicked back. You either get approved or denied. When you get approved, you go through some, again, pretty intense medical examinations. The US does not welcome folks who have particular diagnoses, and historically have not allowed folks with HIV or AIDS, and then other communicable diseases. You then go through a cultural orientation before you arrive in the US, about the US. You travel to the US. And when you travel to the US, what do you all think? Do you get a plane ticket to the US and you arrive? Most people would say yes. Really, what you do is you take out a loan. So you come from nothing, you take out a loan. This is the same for women who are pregnant. Yep. No, there is no differentiation between your health, your mental health, or anything. When you're designated a refugee, you will come and they will, before they place you in a place, they may say this person has higher needs. But typically everything looks very much the same. Yeah, you take out a loan to come to the US. So when you arrive in the US, you are already indebted monetarily to the United States government as a refugee, and you work to pay off your loan with interest. Then you arrive to the US, and that's whenever you go through the refugee resettlement process. I'll describe that pretty briefly, because I know we're limited on time. But I also just want to acknowledge that there are the refugee admissions to the United States fluctuates drastically. Does anyone know how we get it says annual ceiling, and that's how many people we would accept into the United States if we wanted to? Does anyone know how we get that annual ceiling each year? See, it looks different each year. So if you look, okay, question was decision by Congress, unemployment rates. Con knows, Con was an intern with me. The president sets the number. So it is an executive office. They set the number each year. You can look at these numbers. You see 1980 all the way up to 2025. You see things dropped in 84, continued to drop. They climbed up, they went down, they stayed pretty, steady. Do you notice this drop here? What might have happened? Sorry, here, this is the number of people who are actually admitted. We set a limit, and then this is who is actually admitted. What do you think is going on here with this number that just drastically drops? About 2000, 9/11. There we go. So we had a ceiling of around 70,000 that people that we would admit into the US. 9/11 happened and we admitted 30,000, which almost all came before September of 2001. That number stayed. Our admissions continued to rise. And then right here, what do you all think happened? The presidential annual ceiling dropped incredibly. Yeah, Trump. So 2016 happens and bam, we just dropped significantly all the way to 2020. So this was before the pandemic. Anyone wants to argue that? But this all happened before the pandemic. Numbers dropped, and we basically, as refugee resettlement agencies, were completely decimated. So obviously, funding is tied to how many people you serve. Whenever you go from serving, 90,000 people to 20,000 in the entire United States, you lose all funding. So we lost an incredible amount of funding and had to just completely strip our program during that era. And then suddenly it climbs, and we've got, if we were to look at 2022, it would be around 60,000. So now we are moving from what's a decimated program to a sudden increase again in arrivals without necessarily having the funding or capacity to match that. So this is what refugee resettlement looks like, and obviously you can see has looked like for decades. Really bad way of doing it. When does Catholic Charities or other agencies become involved? Great question. That's going to be my next. So our local it's kind of next. So our local trends. So this is national. Our local trends followed very similarly. So we have 2.5 refugee resettlement agencies. We have 3, 2 that are currently in operation. Refugee resettlement agencies. And those are Catholic Charities and Congregation B'nai Amunah. Kanohana resettled for a time and may start to do that again. But they are the refugee resettlement agencies. And so they meet people at the airport. They get them their first apartment or home, and they work with them for 90 days. After those 90 days, they all get moved to YWCA, and we work with them for the next 5 to 7 years. So trends were Catholic Charities was the only resettlement agency in Tulsa up until the Afghan arrivals. So Catholic Charities resettled 53 individuals from Burma, Syria, and Russia in between January 2020 and September 2021. Sorry that it's not like full years, but basically a year and 3 quarters, we had 53 individuals arrive. From just October 2021 to April 2022, 6 months, we had a new refugee resettlement agency, the synagogue, resettle the same amount of folks who came through in the last year and 3 quarters. And then Catholic Charities resettled 800 Afghan individuals. Kanohana had 8 Afghan individuals. So we went from 53 to 900, over 900 in a very, very, very short amount of On top of that, the synagogue was also continuing to resettle other refugee populations. So they, in just that time period, also resettled 12 individuals from Burma. So there's two separate kind of like programs that happen. So there's resettlement and placement. And like I mentioned, those are typically, well, in Tulsa, it's through Catholic Charities and Congregation B'nai Amunah. They do housing, they sign them up and enroll them for benefits. So with SNAP, Sooner Care, WIC, all kinds of things that people qualify for. They get them enrolled in school. They get them enrolled in what's called refugee cash assistance, which is some supplemental monies, not a ton. And then get them signed up with doctors. And they do that all within 90 days. So they have a very specific checklist of things they have to accomplish within those 90 days. We then take everyone after those 90 days and provide refugee social services. We are the only refugee social service agency in Tulsa. So every single person that gets resettled in Tulsa comes to us for, like I said, 5 years, sometimes 7 if needed. We provide assistance in getting folks their first job, often their second job or third job. We do all of their renewals and benefits. So we become their main contact, Sooner Care, WIC, SNAP. We apply for SSI when possible. We do assistance with refugee cash assistance. We offer legal assistance. We provide English classes, social adjustment, cultural orientation. And then we've added on through additional funding. We've added on assistance with housing and transportation because those have continued to be just an enormous hurdle for people to overcome. Yeah. So the idea behind resettlement in the U.S. is you arrive in the U.S. and within 90 days, you're expected to start your first job and start to, well, really within those 90 days, start to pay for everything on your own. So it's a pretty brutal welcome. Our Afghan refugee services have expanded, like I mentioned. We offer employment. We are offering transportation assistance, or we have been. The state's about to cut our budget, so we won't be able to provide much transportation assistance in the future. We offer housing assistance, so moving people from some really, when everyone arrived in Tulsa, as anyone who has done anything around housing, you know that Tulsa is often at between 96 and 98% occupancy. So there are very few homes for people and apartments for people to live in, much less affordable or good conditions. So everyone arriving at once really put a strain on the housing, and people were put into, there were very few options. People were put into some really bad conditions, and just exorbitant rent. So we are spending a lot of time this year moving people from those places to any place we can find that is affordable and non-exploitative and kind and better conditions. And yes, as Casey mentioned, big families. So typically in the past, when we've resettled families, Burmese families are large typically, but our Afghan families came, most were larger families with children, 5 children or more. So we've got families of 13, 14 who are attempting to survive in the US with 1 to maybe 2 incomes and that many children. And as we all know, it's hard enough to be from the US to survive with children. So there's just a ton of hurdles. Like I also mentioned, legal assistance, education, and then we have a new program that popped up because of the needs around health and medical. So a lot of people came with substantial medical needs just from not being able to access preventative care in Afghanistan. So we're doing a lot around ensuring people are getting access to the dentist is a good one, and some cancer treatment. Okay, so lastly of community building, which is very social work, and it's like should be the focus of every resettlement and refugee agency everywhere. So community building is what like the end goal, right? So the end goal is not to continue to provide services for people, but it's to really set up structural success for newcomers. And that looks a lot like community building. So really, I consider it our responsibility as the welcoming community when we say, come to Tulsa, we will help you integrate into the United States. It is our responsibility as Tulsans to be able to provide a welcoming and supportive infrastructure. So not just people who are kind, but create an infrastructure and environment that supports newcomers. So this often means, yes, a welcoming community. That's essential, right? But that also looks like a government with laws that work to create more access instead of limiting access. It means inclusion. So having places where people can shop that are affordable. So a lot of people who come here who are Muslim have a really hard time finding affordable halal meat or food. And are often spending a lot more money because there's just not a plethora of halal food in Tulsa yet. There must be opportunities for people to survive. So there must be employment that is non-exploitative, that allows room for people to learn the language, that allows accommodations for folks from different religious backgrounds. And includes all of us. We have to be able to provide trauma-informed, culturally appropriate services for people in our community. Social connection is also huge. So they're places of worship. So for our Burmese community, they have created and built community really from specific Burmese churches that have created this huge opportunity for folks to connect on multiple levels. There needs to be parks and recreation. There needs to be schools that are accessible and really supportive of youth. Tulsa Public Schools has actually done a fantastic job of providing services and schooling for our Afghan youth in particular. Civic participation is an important part of feeling like you're part of the community. So providing citizenship classes is really important, doing voter registration drives, and then also just education on what are your rights. A lot of people don't know that before you become a U.S. citizen, what can you participate in and what you shouldn't. Just knowing your rights as a resident. For me, I consider it incredibly important to hire from within the community. So that ensures folks are getting good employment, but they also are building up their participation in everything we do. Voter registration happens typically after people are citizens, right? So making sure that when people go through the green card process and then become citizens, that they have access to, that they are signed up for voting and that they also have access to voting. So that means making sure folks know when voting happens, where to vote, how to change your address, all of that comes really for, if you think about when you become a citizen of another country, that doesn't mean you automatically know all the ways in which you should participate or can participate. Also trust. So that means making sure that we are not promoting oppressive laws, oppressive systems that don't meet people where they are and aren't equitable. So most of my team are refugees, either from the past 5 years or more recently in the last year. And so I asked them like what made them feel like they were a part of the Tulsa community. A lot of them have become very engaged in the work and in our community. So these were their responses. So I think it's important to hear from them specifically, like what does community building look like? Some of them arrived with their family or met their family here. So we have a lot of the Burmese community who have arrived, who are finally reunited with their family. Their home church, their place of worship, employment was a big thing. So they said, this was one of our caseworkers, he said, when we got the job first time, we made friendships with other employees, and our employer guided us on how to connect with Tulsa, how to make communication Tulsa, and also introducing us to Tulsa. So just having connections from people who are part of the community. Food, again, places of worship, and just people in the community. A lot of the challenges that Tulsa faces is around xenophobia, so just not knowing and not really, and being fearful of people who are different, particularly if they look different or they worship different. Infrastructure is massive in Tulsa, so not having affordable public transportation, not having good housing options, not having great employment opportunities. And then youth in particular are facing a transition to an entirely new culture while also being a teenager in general. So they're dealing with everything that regular teenagers face on top of all of these things. And then lastly, what made it difficult to feel connected? People said the food, so it's really hard if you don't have food that you like, language skills, just the American culture, transportation, all of that. I'm speeding up really quickly. So what we've done at YW is try to build community through formal processes and then also informal. So we provide a lot of opportunities for informal get-togethers. This is a picture of actually FC Tulsa soccer players playing a Burmese sport with our Burmese refugees. Multiple pictures of my child. And then we do a lot of potluck, just as informal. And same, we went to a hockey game together, just experienced things together as a community. Sorry, I rushed through those last ones, but I wanted to make sure we got done on time. Are there any questions? And yes, Natalie, food is just a huge, huge way to connect and to unite a community. It's been kind of the key to us community building within our own agency. Just having folks from all different cultures get together and even just explain like what the food is, where it comes from, is a really big thing. Has the Afghan Adjustment Act been passed? Great question, Han. No. So the Afghan Adjustment Act was put before Congress. It would have been a path towards refugee status, essentially, for our Afghan newcomers, Afghan parolees. It was never voted on. So basically it did not pass. And that means that a lot of folks who fought for our US military, who then couldn't stay in Afghanistan because of their connection to our US military, were then brought to the US and are now facing a potential lack of status or ability to work if things do not change within the next 7 months. Yeah. If you all want more information on the Afghan Adjustment Act, that's that.
Are you interested in sharing your contact information or any other links or anything in the chat? Because I'm sure people would love to have those.
Here's my email. And then this is our website, has some information. Yeah, has a bunch of information. If you're interested in volunteering, we have a volunteer portal. It's project-based. So we have a driving club where we're teaching Afghan women how to drive. I did it a couple weeks ago. It's a little bit terrifying, but it's also really cool. And it's just a really cool way to spend like 2 hours on a Saturday. But we've got a lot of other opportunities for folks to get involved, whether like you want to do administrative stuff or participate in some of our programming.
Well, thank you so much. I mean, we have a couple more minutes, so if anybody has any more questions, we have a couple of minutes, but I just wanted to go ahead and say thank you so much for being here and for sharing with us. This is a really interesting talk, so thank you. Anybody? Okay. I'm going to go ahead and post again the CEU link and information for anybody who needs to do that. And then, so coming up, we have Laura Bellis, who's going to join us in about 15 minutes here. And so we'll see you all soon.